Welcome to the Real Free News audio podcast. Today, we explore the historical and modern aspects of deputization in U.S. law enforcement. This analysis critiques systemic constraints on civilian involvement while discussing potential reforms for enhanced public safety and alternatives in protection measures amid ongoing debates. Let's get into it. The practice of deputization in the United States represents a historical mechanism for extending law enforcement authority to civilians in times of need, rooted in English common law and the posse comitatus principle. This allowed sheriffs to summon citizens for temporary assistance in pursuits, quelling unrest, or maintaining order, particularly in eras without professional police forces. However, contemporary applications reveal significant constraints, as deputization is confined to supervised, incident-specific roles, raising questions about its adequacy in addressing modern threats where official responses appear insufficient. Critics argue that the rigid separation between permanent and temporary law enforcement roles perpetuates inequalities, where trained officers hold monopolies on power while civilians face vulnerabilities. Permanent positions, requiring elections or appointments followed by extensive training and oaths, ensure accountability but often fail to adapt to community needs, especially in cases of perceived corruption or inaction. This structure invites scrutiny over whether it prioritizes institutional protection over public safety, prompting calls for reevaluating civilian involvement. Alternative ideas for empowering citizens, such as temporary grants of authority for self-protection or investigation, challenge the status quo by suggesting mechanisms to bridge gaps in enforcement. These proposals, while controversial, open avenues for discussion on implementation, including legal reforms or community-based programs. By examining historical foundations alongside current limitations, this essay critiques the system's shortcomings and explores pathways for change, fostering a debate on balancing order with equity. Historical development of temporary law enforcement. The posse comitatus tradition originated in medieval England as a compulsory civic duty, enabling sheriffs to mobilize citizens against threats, with non-compliance leading to penalties. This system was designed to harness the collective strength of the community in an age before organized police forces, where local sheriffs acted as the primary enforcers of the king's peace. Citizens were expected to respond promptly to calls for aid, whether in apprehending thieves, suppressing riots, or defending against invasions, fostering a sense of shared responsibility for law and order. In America, this concept evolved during colonial and frontier periods, where sheriffs deputized posses for manhunts or conflicts, reflecting a reliance on communal self-policing amid sparse resources. The vast landscapes and limited governmental infrastructure necessitated such improvisational measures, allowing ordinary individuals to temporarily wield authority in pursuit of justice. However, these practices, while effective in isolated contexts like tracking outlaws across rugged terrains, often became entangled with injustices, such as suppressing labor disputes in mining towns, thereby highlighting early flaws in unchecked civilian power and the potential for bias or overreach in hastily assembled groups. The 19th century shift toward professional police in urban areas, beginning with departments in cities like Boston and New York, diminished posse usage by introducing dedicated, salaried officers trained in systematic enforcement. This transition marked a departure from ad hoc civilian involvement, as growing populations and complex social issues demanded more consistent and accountable policing structures. Yet, sheriffs retained authority under common law for rural emergencies, preserving the option to call upon posses in scenarios where professional resources were stretched thin, such as during widespread unrest or natural calamities. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 further delineated boundaries by prohibiting military domestic involvement, a response to post-Civil War tensions where federal troops had been used in southern states, thus emphasizing civilian over federal force but not altering local deputization powers. This legislation reinforced the principle that law enforcement should remain in the hands of local authorities and their civilian adjuncts, avoiding the militarization of domestic affairs. 20th century events, such as violent posses in strikes like the Latimer Massacre of 1897, exposed risks of amateurism, where untrained deputies contributed to tragic outcomes, leading to a decline in favor of trained forces and underscoring the need for critical assessment of historical tools in modern governance, as society grappled with the balance between expediency and ethical application. Critiquing this evolution reveals how professionalization, intended to enhance reliability and reduce abuses, may have alienated communities by centralizing power in elite, bureaucratic institutions distant from everyday citizen concerns. The move away from communal posses arguably eroded grassroots participation in justice, creating a divide where law enforcement became a specialized profession rather than a shared duty, potentially fostering public distrust when officials appear unresponsive. Alternative historical models like structured auxiliary programs that emerged in some states during the early 20th century suggest ways to implement safer civilian roles through partial training and formal oversight, blending the flexibility of posses with modern accountability. Opening these to discussion could involve re-evaluating state laws to revive limited posse functions, perhaps through community-nominated deputies or emergency response teams, debating their potential to address contemporary gaps like under-policed rural areas without repeating past abuses, such as discriminatory enforcement or excessive violence. Permanent versus temporary law enforcement roles. Permanent law enforcement demands rigorous criteria, including age, citizenship, education, and academy completion, enforced by state standards to mitigate misconduct and ensure a baseline of competence. These requirements, often overseen by peace officer standards and training commissions, include physical fitness tests, psychological evaluations, and continuous education to adapt to evolving legal landscapes. Sheriffs, elected at county levels and embodying a democratic element unique to American policing, along with appointed chiefs in municipal settings, oversee these roles, with oaths binding officers to uphold constitutional duties and serve the public impartially. This framework aims for professionalism but faces criticism for fostering inertia, where officers prioritize low-risk tasks like traffic enforcement over complex crimes, potentially due to performance metrics tied to quantifiable outcomes rather than community impact. Such priorities can lead to perceptions of inefficiency, as resources are diverted from proactive investigations into revenue-generating activities, leaving serious issues like organized crime or fraud unaddressed. Temporary deputization, exercised mainly by sheriffs drawing on common law traditions, bypasses full qualifications for short-term, supervised aid in crises like disasters or large-scale disturbances. This allows for rapid mobilization without the delays of formal hiring, but it is inherently limited to specific incidents, with deputies acting under direct guidance to prevent misuse. Unlike reserves requiring abbreviated training, typically 200 to 500 hours focusing on essentials like de-escalation and legal basics, ad hoc grants are rare due to liability concerns, as untrained individuals pose risks of injury or legal errors that could burden departments financially. This disparity critiques the system's inflexibility, as it denies civilians equivalent tools when facing threats, potentially exacerbating vulnerabilities in underserved areas where police presence is minimal or response times are prolonged, thus highlighting a structural bias toward institutional preservation over citizen empowerment. Alternative approaches include expanding reserve programs or allowing chiefs broader authority to deputize in urban contexts, implemented via legislative amendments for volunteer certification that could standardize partial training across jurisdictions. These reforms might involve creating hybrid models where civilians undergo modular courses tailored to local needs, such as community policing or emergency response. Discussing these could explore pilot initiatives in high-crime states, like testing expanded reserves in areas plagued by gang activity, weighing benefits such as increased manpower and community trust against risks of overreach, including potential for unqualified actions or perpetuation of biases. Questioning whether such reforms truly empower marginalized groups or merely extend existing biases invites broader debate on inclusivity, ensuring that empowerment extends beyond dominant demographics to foster equitable participation in law enforcement. Limitations on deputization for personal protection. Deputization serves collective enforcement, not individual defense, prohibiting grants for self-protection or pursuit of personal threats, as its core purpose is to augment official capacity in public emergencies rather than privatize authority. Sheriff's authority remains task-oriented and supervised, rejecting uses as alternatives to protective custody, increased patrols, or witness programs, which are designed specifically for personal safety. This restriction critiques the system's reactive nature, leaving citizens exposed to ongoing dangers while officials retain qualified immunities that shield them from liability, raising equity concerns in threat scenarios where individuals must navigate risks without comparable protections. often resulting in a sense of abandonment by the very institutions meant to safeguard them. Even under deputization, powers are narrow, excluding independent actions that could lead to vigilantism charges or civil lawsuits for false imprisonment. Self-defense laws, varying by state with doctrines like stand your ground permitting force against imminent harm, do not extend to preemption or offensive pursuits, highlighting a critical gap where warnings or prior reports go unheeded due to evidentiary thresholds. Such limitations underscore institutional failures, where perceived corruption, laziness, or resource misallocation allows dangers to escalate unchecked, as officers may avoid complex cases in favor of simpler duties, perpetuating a cycle of inaction that erodes public confidence and leaves vulnerable populations at greater risk. Alternatives propose situational empowerment for threatened individuals, implemented through emergency swearing-in protocols with oversight, such as time-limited deputization tied to verified threats and requiring judicial approval to ensure legitimacy. These could include mechanisms for civilians to assist in their own protection under guidance, like coordinated surveillance or arrests with professional backup. Opening this to debate might involve case studies of hypothetical reforms, such as programs in pilot jurisdictions where threatened whistleblowers receive temporary authority, discussing safeguards like judicial review or mandatory debriefs to prevent abuse, and critiquing whether this addresses root causes like systemic underfunding or merely shifts responsibility onto citizens without resolving underlying inefficiencies in official responses. Citizens' arrest and civilian enforcement boundaries. Citizens' arrest represents a vestige of common law empowering private individuals to detain suspects in limited circumstances, primarily for felonies or breaches of the peace witnessed directly, with the obligation to promptly transfer custody to official authorities while employing only reasonable force to effect the detention. This mechanism varies significantly across states. For instance, some jurisdictions like California permit arrests for felonies based on reasonable belief, even if not observed, whereas others, such as post-reform Georgia, restrict it narrowly to prevent misuse. Critiquing its inadequacy for ongoing threats, the narrow scope often leaves civilians exposed to protracted dangers without legal recourse, especially when law enforcement dismisses preliminary reports or fails to intervene proactively, thereby placing the burden on victims to endure harm before any action can be justified. This reactive design underscores a fundamental critique. It prioritizes procedural safeguards for suspects over immediate protection for potential victims, potentially emboldening perpetrators who exploit delays in official responses. Proactive pursuits or investigations by civilians, however, carry substantial legal risks, including charges of assault, false imprisonment, or stalking, as the system maintains a strict monopoly on comprehensive enforcement to uphold due process and prevent arbitrary detentions. Historical abuses, particularly racially motivated detentions during eras of segregation or more recent high-profile cases like the Ahmaud Arbery incident, have spurred legislative reforms aimed at curtailing overreach and emphasizing the need for critical reevaluation of citizen involvement in justice. The system's architecture is intended to avert societal chaos by channeling authority through trained professionals, yet it arguably favors perpetrators by mandating intervention only after crimes occur, thus delaying justice and heightening vulnerabilities in communities where police resources are strained or misallocated. Alternative expansions could broaden criteria to encompass credible threats or patterns of harassment, implemented through statutory changes that incorporate mandatory civilian training programs to ensure responsible use. For example, states could pilot enhanced citizens' arrest statutes requiring certification in de-escalation and evidence gathering, similar to reserve officer curricula, to mitigate risks while empowering communities. Discussing implementation might involve community forums or stakeholder roundtables to gauge public support, questioning if such enhanced powers genuinely reduce crime rates or inadvertently invite discrimination and escalation, thereby opening pathways for balanced legislative dialogue that weighs empowerment against constitutional protections and societal equity. Contemporary cases and perceived systemic failures. Cases in Aurora, Colorado, involving alleged gang activities by Venezuelan nationals affiliated with groups like Tren de Aragua, exemplify deep frustrations with enforcement gaps that leave communities feeling besieged. Reports of extortion, apartment takeovers, and violent incidents have prompted arrests and federal collaborations, yet persistent claims of police overwhelm, inaction, or selective enforcement fuel critiques of resource allocation and priorities that seem to favor containment over eradication. This situation highlights how immigration-related crimes can exacerbate community tensions, with citizens perceiving abandonment by authorities who are either under-resourced or influenced by political pressures, leading to a breakdown in trust and calls for alternative protective measures. In Minnesota, exposures of fraud in Somali-owned facilities by independent journalist Nick Shirley and his associate David reveal parallel issues of systemic neglect. Videos documented apparently empty operations receiving substantial public funds, sparking federal probes and fund freezes, but also resulting in severe threats against the exposers, including death threats to Shirley interpreted as assassination warnings and claims by David of physical attacks and ongoing harassment. Police responses during investigations, such as evicting Shirley and David from sites rather than immediately probing fraud claims, critique institutional priorities that appear to favor maintaining the status quo or protecting certain interests over pursuing accountability, especially amid allegations of long-standing awareness without decisive action. These dynamics amplify perceptions of corruption or bias-shielding offenders, particularly in immigrant-heavy fraud schemes tied to public programs. These examples open broader discussions on systemic failures, where alleged corruption, bias, or incompetence purportedly protects criminal elements while exposing whistleblowers to retaliation. Alternatives like escalated reporting to federal agencies, such as the FBI or DHS, could implement change by bypassing local inertia, as seen in surged investigations following viral exposures. Debating their effectiveness might involve analyzing case outcomes to critique whether they sufficiently address underlying distrust or merely provide temporary relief, while exploring community-led audits or partnerships to foster transparency and proactive enforcement. Legal and societal risks of expanded civilian powers. Empowering civilians with arrest or investigative authority poses significant risks of eroding due process, as untrained individuals may invite errors, personal vendettas, or biased applications without the accountability mechanisms inherent in professional policing. Vigilantism laws across all states explicitly prohibit private militias or unauthorized enforcement groups, critiquing such proposals as potential escalators of violence that could transform disputes into widespread conflicts. Targeting specific demographics, such as immigrant communities, further raises constitutional concerns under equal protection clauses, potentially exacerbating social divisions and fostering environments ripe for discrimination or retaliatory cycles. Historical precedents of posse misuse, from lynch mobs in the post-Reconstruction South to violent interventions in labor disputes, inform contemporary cautions, illustrating how unchecked civilian power has repeatedly led to grave injustices and societal harm. The current system's reactive focus is designed to protect fundamental rights by requiring probable cause and oversight, yet it draws critique for its slowness in addressing imminent threats, thereby leaving citizens vulnerable in scenarios where warnings are dismissed. Such implications demand rigorous scrutiny of equity and protection, questioning whether the monopoly on force truly serves all segments of society or disproportionately burdens those in high-risk areas. Alternatives emphasize non-confrontational methods, such as neighborhood watches focused on observation and reporting, implemented through local organization with formal police liaisons to ensure coordination and legality. These could be expanded via community grants for training in surveillance and de-escalation, providing a safer avenue for involvement. Discussing these options might involve public hearings or policy workshops to refine models, questioning if they genuinely empower without overstepping into vigilantism, and opening debates on integrating them with existing structures to enhance overall responsiveness while mitigating risks of abuse or inequality. Implementation strategies for civilian alternatives. Structured reserves represent a viable middle ground for civilian involvement in law enforcement, offering partial authority through supervised roles that require abbreviated training, thereby critiquing the inherent risks of full, ad hoc deputization, such as liability from untrained actions or potential for abuse. This model allows volunteers to assist in tasks like event security, traffic control, or auxiliary patrols under professional oversight, addressing enforcement gaps in under-resourced areas without granting unchecked powers that could lead to vigilantism. Implementation could begin with state certification programs, where legislatures mandate standardized curricula, perhaps 200 to 400 hours focusing on legal basics, de-escalation techniques, and ethical guidelines, funded through grants from federal sources like the Department of Justice's community policing initiatives. Advocacy for expansion might involve grassroots campaigns by citizen groups lobbying for budget allocations, highlighting success stories from existing reserve programs in states like California or Texas to demonstrate reduced response times and enhanced community trust. Critiquing the current system's over-reliance on permanent officers, who may prioritize career advancement over proactive engagement, political advocacy emerges as a key strategy for implementing reforms, such as electing sheriffs with platforms emphasizing broader deputization authority or community empowerment. This approach fosters accountability by shifting leadership toward those responsive to public demands, potentially through voter initiatives that amend county charters to include civilian oversight boards. Debates on this could explore campaign strategies, including digital mobilization via social media or town halls to prioritize community safety issues, while questioning long-term impacts on institutional trust, such as whether empowered sheriffs might politicize enforcement or genuinely bridge gaps in protection for vulnerable populations. Opening these discussions in academic forums or policy think tanks could weigh the benefits of democratic selection against risks of populism, encouraging models where sheriffs collaborate with civic organizations for transparent selection of reserves. Self-defense enhancements, such as expanding concealed carry permits or access to non-lethal tools, provide immediate, personal tools for civilians without necessitating full police powers, critiquing the traditional reliance on officials who may delay responses due to bureaucratic hurdles. Implementation could occur via mandatory training courses integrated into permit processes, offered through community colleges or online platforms, ensuring participants learn legal boundaries, situational awareness, and conflict resolution to minimize misuse. This critiques systemic dependencies by empowering individuals directly, yet opens forums to discuss integration with existing reporting mechanisms, such as apps linking self-defense incidents to real-time police alerts for comprehensive protection. Broader debates might examine equity issues, questioning if such enhancements disproportionately benefit certain demographics or exacerbate disparities, while proposing hybrid implementations like subsidized training for low-income areas to promote inclusive safety measures and intellectual discourse on balancing autonomy with collective security. Broader societal transformations and debates. Transforming enforcement structures demands comprehensive legislative overhauls at federal and state levels, critiquing existing policies on immigration that some argue enable unchecked crime by facilitating entry without adequate vetting, thereby straining local resources and fostering environments ripe for gang activities. Alternatives include forming victim advocacy groups to pressure for independent audits of immigration enforcement and fraud programs, implemented through coalitions partnering with nonprofits and legal aid organizations to gather evidence and lobby Congress for reforms like enhanced border security measures or deportation protocols for convicted offenders. This approach opens discussions on addressing invasion narratives without succumbing to bias, perhaps through bipartisan panels that analyze data on crime patterns to separate factual trends from sensationalism, encouraging policies that prioritize community integration while holding accountable those exploiting systemic loopholes. Community-driven initiatives such as neighborhood watches implement observation-based security models that empower residents to monitor and report suspicious activities, critiquing police forces as overly revenue-focused through ticket quotas rather than crime-solving oriented. These programs could be rolled out via local ordinances establishing formal training sessions and coordination with law enforcement, funded by municipal grants or crowdfunding, to equip participants with tools like surveillance apps or communication networks. Debates on their efficacy could assess roles in supplementing official forces, questioning if they effectively reduce disparities in protection, particularly for marginalized communities, or inadvertently create new ones by fostering exclusionary practices. Opening this to scholarly analysis might involve case studies from successful implementations in urban areas, weighing community empowerment against potential for overvigilance. Ultimately, these transformative ideas invite critical examination of power distribution within society, proposing hybrid models that blend civilian input with professional oversight to debate the future of equitable safety. Implementation pathways could emphasize gradual reforms, such as phased pilot programs in select jurisdictions to test integrated systems of reserves, watches, and enhanced self-defense, allowing for data-driven adjustments. Fostering intellectual discourse through conferences or publications on these topics encourages exploration of long-term societal impacts, critiquing institutional flaws like corruption or inertia while advocating for adaptive frameworks that redistribute authority responsibly, ensuring protections extend to all citizens amid evolving threats. Conclusion: historical roots to modern critiques and civilian power alternatives. Deputization's historical utility as a flexible tool for emergency response starkly contrasts with modern critiques of its limitations, which expose systemic inertias in providing timely protection and often prioritize procedural rigidity over practical needs. Permanent roles, with their rigorous standards including extensive training and oaths, ensure a baseline of professionalism and accountability, yet they frequently fail in responsiveness, leaving gaps in addressing immediate community threats or complex crimes due to resource misallocation or institutional biases. Temporary options, while underutilized, offer glimpses of potential empowerment, but remain confined to supervised, short-term applications, prompting calls for reevaluation to make them more accessible and adaptive in an era of perceived enforcement failures. Contemporary cases, from gang-related issues in Aurora to fraud exposures in Minnesota, underscore profound frustrations, critiquing official inaction amid escalating threats and fraudulent activities that erode public trust. Legal risks associated with empowerment alternatives, such as eroding due process or inviting vigilantism, demand careful implementation through safeguards like judicial oversight and training mandates, opening debates on balancing equity with security. Strategies like structured reserves, political advocacy, or community initiatives provide viable paths forward, questioning the sustainability of traditional monopolies on force, and exploring how they might be reformed to better serve diverse populations without compromising constitutional principles. Broader transformations in societal structures necessitate ongoing, multifaceted discussion, critiquing deep-rooted institutional flaws while actively exploring expanded citizen roles in justice and safety. By implementing community and political mechanisms, such as legislative coalitions for policy overhauls or integrated self-defense programs, society can systematically address vulnerabilities stemming from immigration policies, fraud schemes, and enforcement gaps. This fosters a more adaptive framework for justice and security, encouraging intellectual engagement on hybrid models that empower civilians responsibly, ultimately aiming for a system where protection is proactive, inclusive, and resilient against both internal inefficiencies and external threats. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News, and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Tune in again, and until then, remember to keep it real. Free news. See you next time.